Thank you. Thank you, thank you. 1, 2, 3, can you hear me? I think we're still testing the sound, yeah, okay. Great. Well, thanks for being here. It's a real pleasure to be in the motherland. My mother's from Sweden, of course, Skåne, but she did study here in Stockholm. So, the presentation today, Panpsychism and Psychedelic Sentience, is going to be quite broad, so you'll probably have a lot of questions. The first part, it's going to be 2 parts. First part, Panpsychism, is more what I'm doing at Exeter University at the moment for my PhD. So the second half will become more speculative, more questionable. But I thought more fun to put ideas out there than be safe. So just to give you that warning. Okay, so let's go. So more specifically, what I'll be doing is I'll be giving you the terms, certain terms. Then I'll be giving you 3 arguments for panpsychism. I'll then talk about reasons for its being forsaken, why panpsychism is not a popular view today, really, in the West. And the second half, really, is the 4th part here, which is 4 modes. I'll be delivering 4 modes of interpreting psychedelic sentience via systems of panpsychism, because if panpsychism is true, then what does that mean for the psychedelic experience? I mean, if we reject, ultimately, materialism, how do we then reinterpret the experiences one can have on psychedelics? Okay, so let's begin. I should say questions will come afterwards, after the presentation. So if you think of any, just note them down. So panpsychism then, what does it mean? Well, pan means all, everything. Psyche means mind or soul. Panpsychism is a word coined by a Renaissance thinker called Patrizzi. And it's the view that sentiences, mentality, exist fundamentally, that means non-reductively, throughout all of actuality. So we ourselves, of course, most of us believe we are sentient, but so are mice. I think most people would accept that. Mycelia, mushroom roots, most people probably wouldn't accept that. Molecules, small number of people, and beyond that. But panpsychism is ultimately the view that sentience exists throughout all of those. So the next question is then, well, what do I mean by sentience? What is consciousness? Well, it's complicated. And I'm not going through all of this, obviously. But I think when you first tell people you believe in panpsychism, they think you're a bit of a nutcase. Because they think that what you're saying, that a chair or a table has human thoughts, memories of what they did last weekend and so on. No, not at all. So this is a big question in philosophy, of course, what sentience is. But by sentience, I mean it's an umbrella term which includes qualia, such as the 5 senses, so it's the bodily feeling, vision, hearing, smell, taste, also the emotions, desires, will, aesthetic appreciation, cognition, which is the power of reason and concepts, and which can be simple, complex, and so on. And then another aspect of sentience is what I call modes of sentience. So we can talk about access consciousness. This is awareness of something. When you're driving a car and you really want to avoid something, you're completely in the mode of access consciousness. But there is an argument from Ned Block and others that there also exists phenomenal sentience, which is still having the experience, let's say, of vision, colors, but not being conscious of it. So when you're driving, quite often you lose it. You're still having all these colors around you, but you're not necessarily conscious of what they are. So you can have sentience without consciousness. And that's quite important for panpsychism, because most panpsychists would deny consciousness to most things. In other words, access consciousness, focus on something, but they will allow for phenomenal consciousness or phenomenal sentience or aesthesis as ubiquitous. Other elements, from Bergson, we have this idea of rhythm of duration, so we perceive reality at a certain speed. We have a speed of time. But that doesn't mean that every creature perceives the world in the same way. A fly probably thinks we're always in slow motion, that's why we can't hit it. Even when you wake up on a Saturday morning, you probably feel a bit slower. So in relation to panpsychism, we would expect microorganisms to have a completely different rhythm of duration to us. And then also we have real perceptions, as it were, veridical perceptions. We see things around us, but also we have memories and imaginations. And so again, in panpsychism, this probably is excluded in most organisms. As well as that, of course, we have alternate forms of consciousness, which is where psychedelics come in. So you have here William James's criteria, Bertrand Russell's, Rudolf Otto's, and so on. But we'll come to that later. But so when a panpsychist says that everything is sentient, the important thing to note is that it does not mean that everything is conscious. Consciousness is the cream on the cake of sentience. You know, it only exists in certain high-level organisms, such as ourselves, mammals, and so on. Where does panpsychism generally fit into mind-matter theories? One way of looking at it is like this. So, in the West, I mean, I was brought up mostly in England, 2 years in Sweden, but in the West, you know, by default, I was sort of inculcated into physicalism or materialism. This has a variety of types. You have reductive physicalism. Eliminativism really doesn't even believe in sentience. Behaviorism thinks you can reduce it to behavior, like happiness is smiling and laughing, so on and so forth. Psychoneural identity theory. We have non-reductive physicalism, which does believe in sentience, consciousness, but it still believes that ultimately that's physicality. At the fundamental level, physicality only exists. The main view today, arguably, is emergentism, which I'll speak about in a moment. Opposed to that, then, we have dualism. Often, a lot of people think if you're not a physicalist, you're a dualist. But as you can see, there are other options as well. Dualism, then, is the belief that mind and matter are two distinct substances. Plato argued for it famously, but Descartes is most famous for it. So he believes that in interactionism, so the mind and the soul somehow interact. Descartes said through the pineal gland, very problematic. Parallelism, mind and matter are parallel, but they're not interactive. Leibniz's view, for example, occasionalism, Malebranche, vitalism, Bergson, so on. There are dualist theories. If you're religious, most religious people, I should say, are dualists. Probably they believe in the soul that will exist after the body. Not so popular in Britain, but in Germany and other countries, we have idealism. So subjective idealism, Berkeley, the view that matter doesn't exist. And that was the opposite of physicalism, It's just a projection of our minds. Transcendental idealism is probably the most respected form there, which is from Immanuel Kant, Schopenhauer, and then dialectical idealism from Hegel and so on. Very interesting, but I used to be a sort of idealist until I realized a big problem with it, which is something called representationalism. It's philosopher Alfred North Whitehead who got me out of idealism, really. Alfred North Whitehead was what is known as a pan-experientialist, which is a form of panpsychism. So panpsychism is neither of these, although there are overlaps. So, for example, Schopenhauer was a transcendental idealist and a panpsychist, you could say. But there's a variety of forms. I'll be mentioning some of these. Cosmopsychism is the view that not only do molecules and bacteria and whatever have sentiences, but also planets, stars, ultimately the universe. There's pan-cognitivism, which is the view that everything has thoughts, concepts. Very unpopular view, but it's there. And then there's all these different words for it today. Like I say, the Whiteheadian one, pan-qualityism, it's from Fiegel. Atomic monism, McGinn. Integrated information theory is a sort of panpsychism from the neuroscience. Tononi came out with that. Christoph Koch is known for it as well. The big thing in panpsychism today is probably Russellian monism from Bertrand Russell. So that's the main focus of contemporary studies into panpsychism, which I can discuss later in more detail if you like. Okay, so why would anyone believe in panpsychism? It's completely nuts, right? Well, I'm going to give you 3 arguments for it. I'm going to avoid all the criticisms. But let's go through but we can discuss that later. So let's go through it. The genetic argument, then. The claim that the existence of that which is not structurally describable, sentience, by which I mean this, that we can describe physical things like this table in terms of space. This is 1.5 meters high and so on. But like, for example, an emotion, you cannot describe it using space. You can describe its physical correlates using space, neurons, whatever, but you can't actually describe what an emotion is by talking about measurements. So the view that that which is not structurally describable, sentience, emerges from that which is, the physical, is so radical, unobservable, unintelligible, and supernatural that the contrary claim, panpsychism, that it doesn't emerge as such, is more reasonable. So, in other words, The argument that mind emerges from what we understand to be matter doesn't make sense. Therefore, it didn't emerge. Therefore, it was always there, panpsychism, very basically. The genetic argument splits into two types. First one is this. This is as logical as it will get today, okay, don't worry. If emergentism is false, as I will show you in a moment, hopefully, and yet if mind exists, does mind exist? Well, you believe it in yourself at least. Then mind must always have existed. If the mind has always existed, then it must have existed in the pre-organic level, molecules, whatever. That is panpsychism. So then I'm going to show that emergentism is false. Mind does exist, therefore mind has always existed. Therefore panpsychism is true. Okay, why is emergentism false? Emergentism then, it's no undue exaggeration to say that we have been under the reign of emergentism since the early 70s, says this unbelievably fantastic philosopher of mind, Jae-Won Kim, Korean-American guy. He's in his 80s or 90s now, I think, still alive. But he is known as the greatest writer on emergentism because he's so clear. And as a result, he's sort of highlighted all the flaws in it. He writes, "The idea of emergence is an attractive and initially appealing one in many ways, and it's not difficult to understand its popularity, but it's not easy to make the idea precise and give it substantive content." Very generally, emergentism, if you haven't heard of it, is this. In nature, we have emergent properties. So from atoms and molecules, we get emergent chemical properties. From chemical properties, emerge biological properties. And then the argument is, analogously, from biological properties, emerges sentience. Right? That just seems to flow. Well, it seems initially appealing, but it's very problematic. Why? Well, a number of reasons, and it gets very complicated, so I can't go into it in detail here, but a few pointers. Correlation between a mind and matter does not per se imply emergence. So we all accept, of course, that certain mental states, like satisfaction, is related to certain brain states. But all we have there, the only empirical proof there we have, is correlation. These correlate. The interesting question is, well, what's the relationship between that correlation? The correlation alone doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that matter, as it were, produces mind. It doesn't mean that mind can have an effect on matter, mental causation. It doesn't mean they're identical. And it doesn't mean that they interact either. All we have is correlation. Correlation simply shows the problem. It doesn't give any answer. Secondly, mind-matter emergence is disanalogous to the matter-matter emergence found in nature. All of those examples I gave you, the classic one is like liquidity emerges from molecules. All of those are examples of where that which is structurally describable, again spatially, something spatial emerges from something spatial. The argument that that's how the mind emerges from matter is disanalogous because, as I was saying, most of the mind, not all of it, most of the mind, most mental properties are not spatially describable. Thirdly, the transordinal nomology, that means the laws of nature which connect matter to mind, required to bridge mind and matter, also known as bridge laws, have not been discovered and would not be empirically discoverable, even in principle, because one cannot see directly the mind of another. Fourthly, and this is the key problem that Jae-Won Kim points out with regard to emergentism. As a physicalist doctrine, emergentism must accept the causal closure of the physical, which means this, that every event has a physical cause, which is completely sufficient. A causes B. Yet it also seeks, and the emergentist also seeks to accept mental causation. So that which emerges has novel properties, which cannot be understood from the lower level. And one of the novel properties of the mental is that it has a power. So in other words, like, for example, my desire to have this drink here caused the moving of my muscles. Now, although that seems obvious to many, it seems completely impossible to many others. Why? Because ultimately you would say, well, that desire actually is reducible to neuronal behavior, and that's physical, and that caused my muscles to move, and that's physical as well, so it's purely physically describable. The problem is, that's epiphenomenalism, the view that mind is just like steam coming off a train. It has no effect, cannot have an effect in a physical world. It can't be a power like gravity or electromagnetism, whatever. The problem with it is number of problems. One is this, from Karl Popper. He said, why would mind have evolved if it has no purpose? Even vestigial organs once had a purpose, but it seems that if you're an epiphenomenalist, you're giving no purpose, no power at all to the mental. So why did it evolve? Not only in humans, but presumably in other beings as well. Why did it not eventually go away if it was some kind of side effect? It seems that epiphenomenalism, which really is a consequence of physicalism, Popper calls it anti-evolutionary. It's an anti-evolutionary theory. There's a lot of other reasons against epiphenomenalism as well. For example, it's been said, if you believe in reason, you must believe in mental causation. If you think that reasoning things out has any effect upon the world, then that is an example of mental causation. We can discuss that in detail later, but I'm just pointing out here that it is a big problem and it hasn't been resolved. So, for a lot of reasons, emergentism, I argue, fails, but I can't convince you now in a few minutes. But, okay. William James argued against emergentism 100 years ago. He writes this: consciousness, however small, is an illegitimate birth in any philosophy that starts without it, and yet professes to explain all facts by continuous evolution. If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things. Interestingly, William James wrote that in a book where he criticized panpsychism, but later on, in A Plural Universe, he came to accept it. So, in other words, if you don't believe in panpsychism, another way to look at this is the following. If you don't believe in panpsychism, you must believe that at some point in evolutionary history, suddenly consciousness or sentience burst into being. But that's a very radical claim that, of course, can't be empirically verified. We can't go back in time. And if you believe that, you need strong evidence for it, which is, of course, lacking. Sewell Wright, who was founder of population genetics, great biologist, he wrote this: the evolution of a new organ involves nothing more mysterious than differential growth. Emergence of this kind poses no serious philosophical difficulty. Emergence of mind from no mind at all is sheer magic. We conclude that the evolution of mind must have been coextensive with the evolution of the body. By body, he means matter here. Moreover, mind must already have been there when life arose, and indeed must be a universal aspect of existence, still assuming that mind cannot arise from nothing. So, that's the genetic argument in various forms against emergentism. And the genetic argument ultimately is this: if emergentism is false, then ipso facto, panpsychism must be true. But that's not the only argument for panpsychism, that's obviously a negative argument. Here's a more positive one, the abstraction argument, as I call it. And it's this: our common notion of matter-energy, physicality, is an abstraction that as such omits sentience as its concrete immanence. Abstraction means when you understand something insufficiently. Bertrand Russell made this point. He writes, the physical world is only known as regards certain abstract features of its space-time structure, features which, because of their abstractness, do not suffice to show whether the physical world is or is not different in intrinsic character from the world of mind. If you look at the history of matter, our notions of matter, we see it changes all the time, from the ancient Greeks, Democritus, and so on, through to understandings of it as having mass, as having nuclear forces, as having spin, and so on. Our notions of matter are evolving. To think, therefore, that our current understanding of matter is sufficient is ahistorical. And the argument of the panpsychist is that in order to avoid problems of emergentism and so on, we have to accept that another aspect of mind, another property that it has, rather, is sentience. Whitehead, who was Russell's teacher and the main philosopher I'm looking at these days, Alfred North Whitehead, in his system, his philosophy of organism, he writes, the notion of physical energy, which is at the base of physics, must then be conceived as an abstraction from the complex energy, emotional and purposeful. So in Whitehead's cosmology, all matter has, there's an emotive aspect to all matter. But of course, we don't see that, just as I do not see your consciousnesses now. I don't see them, I infer them. But for him, they are everywhere. What would that intrinsic aspect be? Well, David Chalmers, famous Australian philosopher who coined the hard problem of consciousness, he is very sympathetic to panpsychism these days. He writes, there is only one class of intrinsic non-relational property with which we have any direct familiarity, and that's the class of phenomenal sentient properties. Sprigg, Timothy Sprigg, who actually came up with this "what is it like to be" phrase, which Thomas Nagel made famous with bats. He writes, if the physical world has an inner being, as it must have, if it's not merely phenomenal, that is a convenient fiction, that inner being must be psychical, sentient, if it is to be anything intelligible at all. Charles Hartshorne, who was a Whiteheadian, he wrote, mindless matter is not a given, but a logical construction, and a negative one. So the idea we have of matter as being mindless is nothing we have actually, but this is an abstraction, a construction, a fiction. Third argument for panpsychism, all these are interrelated, the inferential argument. I infer that you have sentience, as I was saying. I can't empirically verify it. I can't see your consciousness. I could see your brains, if you're in hospital or whatever. I could see correlates of your consciousness, but I couldn't directly see your consciousness. So I infer it. I also infer it to my pet dog, my pet cat, sheep, so on. Why? Because they're similar to me, they have brains, I suppose, and so on. Descartes famously said that all animals are machines, only humans had souls. Well, actually, he was a bit ambivalent. He said magpies had sensations, but that contradicted his whole machine thing. It's a complicated matter. But generally, he's known for saying, only humans have souls. If we only relied on proof, empirical proof of what animals or what creatures had sentience, we would be solipsists, which means that you only believe that your own mind is real. You yourself are real. Everyone else is just an automaton, a robot. So, in other words, inference is our only means. Proof is not a valid means of reasoning here. So we generally infer that other animals have sentience, but why not plants, fungi, and so on? Why? Well, generally speaking, it's believed that neurophysiology is necessary for sentience, brains, in other words. Now I'll bring in Fechner, Gustav Fechner, who I'll speak about more in detail later. He made this analogy. He says, you can't use empirical evidence when it comes to these deep mind-matter problems. So he makes this little analogy, little poem, really. He writes, if I remove or destroy all the strings of a piano, a violin, a lute, then there will be no tone to the instrument. So obviously the strings are the essential means for producing tones. They are, so to say, the nerves of these instruments. But now, when I hear that the flute, after all, does actually produce tones, in spite of my pretty argument, I can't see why plants might not be able to produce subjective sensations without having nerves. The animals might be the string instruments of sensation, and the plants the wind instruments. Might be. Okay. But of course, you'll say to me something like this. You'll say, yeah, but we know that, we know how a plant functions. It moves towards the light because of photosynthesis, blah, 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 right? You can explain a plant's movement in terms of efficient causality, physical causes. However, you could also say that about a person. You could fully explain the movements of a person through physiology if you investigated them. But we still attribute sentience to a human, don't we? So why draw the line, or where do you draw the line for sentience? We know that plants have sensation. This is from Daniel Chamovitz. We now know that Arabidopsis has at least 11 different photoreceptors. Some tell a plant when to germinate, some tell it when to bend to the light, some tell it when to flower, and some let it know when it's nighttime. Some let the plant know that there's a lot of light hitting it, some let it know that the light is dim, and some help it to keep time. So, okay, a plant can perceive light. In a way, the leaf is like an eye. It has photoreceptors. It's just not a complicated eye like we have. The ultimate point that Whitehead makes is this, though. To sense does not require sense organs. Sense organs are just very elaborate forms of essentially what is causality. So we have no reason to limit inference to mentality to creatures with brains. If we limit it to behavior, then we are practically panpsychists anyway, because you have to include plants and so on, viruses. So without reason for limitation, we extend the inference all the way throughout nature, and that's panpsychism then. If you do want to limit sentience to some point, then you have to make a very good case where that would be. The problem is, of course, you can't get subjective reports on anything other than the human. So it's in principle impossible to find this out. Why then? Now, okay, there's three arguments. There are problems as well I haven't got time to go into. But the case is being made by people like Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, Galen Strawson, analytic philosophers, that panpsychism is a viable philosophy of mind. Partly because we've come to this impasse in the philosophy of mind. We just cannot explain the relationship of mind to matter. We've come to a cul-de-sac. Panpsychism seems at least a viable option, not just some crazy stuff. Why is it spurned? Why is it not popular here in the West? A number of reasons. One is there are criticisms of it, rational ones, like the combination problem that I can discuss later. But Whitehead attributes this, and a lot of people do, to Descartes. He writes, the disastrous separation of body and mind, which has been fixed on European thought by Descartes, is responsible for this blindness of science. What do you mean by that? Descartes famously then came up with dualism. Mind and matter are separate substances. What seems to have happened, though, is this, that he created then nature as completely mindless, completely mathematical, mechanical. And we seem to have inherited that view of nature, discarded the soul, at least us in the secular West here, discarded the idea of the soul, but then, with this mechanical, mathematically describable nature left bequeathed by Descartes, we've suddenly got this problem like, oh shit, how does the mind relate to this? And then we come up with all these theories about, identity and emergence and functionalism, blah, 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 but they all just don't work, or at least no one agrees about them. There's very little agreement here. A second reason, and this is a little pet theory of mine, and I can't prove it in any way, but it's a research topic. I believe there's probably a bit of Christian suppression of this view of panpsychism. For example, the Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, they famously burned Bruno. Bruno was a great scientist and panpsychist. They burnt Bruno at the stake in 1600, considered any kind of panpsychism, which, like I said, became prevalent in the Renaissance as heresy. And of course, at the time, the Catholic Church had a lot of political power, as it still does in South America and so on. And the legacy is still with us. Thirdly now, another reason is the prosaic fallacy. And this comes from Charles Hartshorne, the Whiteheadian. And this is the link to psychedelics. The disinclination of many to accept psychicalism, or panpsychism, probably arises partly from the immense demands which the doctrine make upon one's imagination. How are we to imagine feelings as different from ours as an atom is from our bodies? But we should avoid the prosaic fallacy, supposing the world to be as tame as our sluggish, convention-ridden imaginations imply. In other words, we are prosaic, probably not most of you here, but a lot of us are prosaic thinkers. We think, well, this is consciousness, I know it through myself, and then I generalize from that particular and think that's what consciousness must be. If it's to be anything, therefore it couldn't possibly exist in, let's say, a virus. Well, how can you get rid of the prosaic fallacy? If psychedelic experience can eliminate such prosaic thought, if, in other words, psychedelic experience can give you access to other forms of sentience, completely alien to that which is normal, then at least that third hindrance to the acceptance of panpsychism might be overcome. In fact, William James may have come to panpsychism this way. For those of you who have not heard of William James, he was a great psychologist, medical doctor, and philosopher. Died in the early 20th century. I'm sure most of you know here, he took psychedelics, one of the first sort of academic psychonauts, really. He writes this, nitrous oxide, this is, of course, a cliche in this quote, and I apologize if you've read it 10 times already, but to those 2 or 3 of you who haven't. Nitrous oxide and ether, especially nitrous oxide, stimulate the mystical consciousness in an extraordinary degree. In the nitrous oxide trance, we have a genuine metaphysical revelation. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, as we call it, prosaic consciousness, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. That was written in 1902 in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. In 1909, in a great book called Pluralistic Universe, he writes this, the drift of all evidence we have seems to me to sweep us very strongly towards the belief, with analogies from religious experience, that establish, when taken together, a decidedly formidable probability in favor of a general view of the world almost identical with Fechner's. Fechner was a panpsychist, of course. So, perhaps one of the reasons that William James ultimately went into a Fechnerian kind of panpsychism is because he had these nitrous oxide experiences. They changed him. They changed his worldview. We know for sure that they made him understand Hegel. He said in an article once that after taking nitrous oxide, I now fully understand Hegel's philosophy. So we know it had that effect on him, and did it have a wider effect? Next question is this. If panpsychism is correct, I'm sure not all of you have accepted it yet, but if it is a correct view of reality, what are the implications for the interpretation of psychedelic experience? What does it mean? In other words, if you're a materialist and you look at psychedelic experience, you're going to say, well, it's all hallucinatory, really. It might be valuable, therapeutically or whatever, but ultimately you don't get any truth from it. You don't get any knowledge from it. But how about if materialism is not true? Some people, I should say, call panpsychism materialism. That's another debate. But let's say that general view of materialism is not true and panpsychism is, then how could we explore our psychedelic experiences? I haven't defined psychedelic experience because, as you are aware, there are so many different varieties. And some of them are ineffable, so I couldn't talk about them anyway. But let's look at these 4 modes of interpretation. Now I'm going to get a bit more speculative. So there's vectorization, enmerosis, as I call it, expansion, and something called the third realm, transcendence. Let's look at the first one now, vectorization. This is from Whitehead. This is why I moved away from idealism reading Whitehead, and I can't do justice to him in a screenshot here. But he writes this. The claim that the cognition of alien mentalities, in other words, other mentalities, must necessarily be by means of indirect inferences from aspects of shape and of sense objects is wholly unwarranted. In other words, Whitehead believes that perception as we understand it from Aristotle, Plato, David Hume and whatnot, that there are 5 senses, is a very limited form of perception. There's another form of perception which he calls perception in the mode of causal efficacy, which is where one actually perceives not only these qualia, these visual qualia, but also emotions and feelings. They actually, it's not an imaginative thing. We actually intake, like we intake light, so we intake emotions. And perception becomes then, when you perceive something, the relationship is not the subject to the object or a representation to the object, but rather part to whole. So my view of somebody else is partly that other thing within me. This is known as vectorization. Now, could it be that psychedelics allow for amplified vectorization? Amplified vectorization, sorry. This is why I'm speaking in English and not Swedish today. In other words, could it be that when you take psychedelics, in certain cases, let's say you're viewing a plant, could that perception actually be a slight fusion of the sentience of that plant, accepting panpsychism? So if you accept panpsychism, you accept that plants have a form of sentience. And if you accept Whitehead's view of perception, which is broader than the general view, then it seems that, yes, you can generally perceive an aspect of the feelings of the plant. But could that be amplified then with psychedelics? Well, Alan Watts writes this: with LSD, 25, mescaline, psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and cannabis, one receives polar awareness, whereby one sees that things that are explicitly different are implicitly one, self and other, subject and object. And there are a myriad accounts of such vectorization. Here's one from Paul Devereaux. He writes, I found my awareness slipping inside that of the daffodil. While still being conscious of sitting in a chair, I could also sense my petals. Then an exquisite sensation cascaded through me, and I knew I was experiencing light falling on these petals. It was virtually orgasmic, the haptic equivalent of an angelic choir. So, the interesting question is this. Well, okay, again, if you accept panpsychism, then you would accept the basic form of sentience to a daffodil. Remember, like I said, not necessarily, almost definitely not consciousness, but some form of pleasure, perhaps. The question then becomes, when you read reports like this or experience things like this, does that mean that you're just simply imagining it? Or could it be that somehow you are partaking of that plant's sentience? Related to that, we have what I call neurosis. Whitehead believes that our general bodily state, our general consciousness, is informed by the micro-sentiences of all our cells, not just in our brain. Perception in the mode of presentational immediacy is the five senses from humans, so on. But like I said, he believes in this other causal efficacy. And could it be that on psychedelics, these are amplified somehow? In other words, your general form of perception is lost, so these other forms, these other plurality of sentiences somehow come to the fore. Could that be why, for example, we sometimes feel a fragmented self? We feel we're not one anymore. We're several things. We're experiencing feelings which are completely alien to us. Could these feelings be those of our bodily selves? Furthermore, the rhythm of duration of subsomatic cells would differ. Thus, a sense of relative temporal distortion might incur. So as I was saying, we would be wrong to think that the speed of time that us humans perceive is absolute. There's no reason why this mode of time is objective at all. If cells, say, had a form of sentience, then presumably they would have a completely different sense of time, and thus we could expect to experience temporal distortions, as is very common. We'd have emotions, feelings. I mean, I know that I've had feelings on psychedelics which are completely alien. I can't even remember them anymore, but I just remember that they were so different to anything I've ever had that a normal phenomenology just cannot account for them. The third way in which we could possibly interpret psychedelic experience is expansion. Let me return to Fechner now, Gustav Theodor Fechner. He was a professor of physics at Leipzig. He was a founder of psychophysics. He was the first person to really make psychology a science, empirically investigating it. He was also a philosopher. He was a panpsychist and a pantheist. Interesting character. William James writes about him. William James was very inspired by him in later works. He had this horrible illness where he was on the brink of death. He almost died. He went completely blind for 3 years. I mean, he couldn't eat for 2 weeks and so on. Anyway, he recovered. And one day he went into his garden and he took away his blindfold, and he had this experience, which is very analogous to many psychedelic experiences. He saw plants have an inner light. They sort of seemed to communicate to him. He saw Earth as a living being, the whole planet as one organism, a bit like Lovelock's Gaia theory, which is later. Fechner came up with this first. So he pushed panpsychism upwards, actually, and I'm not personally going there. I'm putting it out there, though. So he pushed it upwards so that unified sentience also instantiates at levels higher than what we call organisms. This is known in the field as cosmopsychism. So planets and stars are sentient, and the universe as a whole is the ultimate sentience, God. Um, he's very explicit about his epistemology, theory of knowledge. He says, only analogy, rather than empirical induction or logical deduction, can be used to decipher the existence of other minds. Neural correlates of consciousness are insufficient. So he was, like I say, a physics professor. He realized that by analogy, he was making these claims. But of course, the problem with arguing from analogy is that it's never certain, like logical deduction is. Induction is never certain either. But he argued that it was most plausible. He also had other arguments. And the interesting theoretical point is this. If we accept that nerve cells, neurons, are not necessary for sentience, if we accept like plants have sentience, for example, or even if we accept that there can be artificial sentience, artificial intelligence and robots, computers, whatever, if we accept the possibility of that, then by the same principle, perhaps you could extend that to the world as a autopoietic, a self-sufficient system. Plato came up with this idea of the world soul in Timaeus 2,500 years ago. Fechner repeats, he writes, Is not the earth in its form and content, like our bodies, and like the bodies also of animals and plants, a unified system, a system relatively closed? Is it not a system which, though it is subject to stimulus and determining influences from without, determines itself and develops from within, engendering inexhaustible variety? In other words, is the world not, we talk about the ecosystem, but of course, generally we say, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's conscious, it's not a living organism. But Fechner says, well, why not? If we haven't determined what kind of structure is required for sentience, how can we say the earth is not sentient? One reason for in the mid-20th century, something called psychoneural identity theory was very common, prevalent. It's the idea that, well, consciousness simply is the neurons. It's the same thing. But that was criticized by people like Fodor, Putnam, because of multiple realization, which is this. If the same mental state can be realized by distinct physical substrates, Putnam talks about hunger in a human and hunger in an octopus, then the correlates cannot be identical. In other words, if you're going to say that hunger simply is a certain pattern in the brain, then you would deny it to all creatures which did not have a human brain, which seems implausible. Surely it's more plausible that, for let's say, an octopus can feel hunger. Of course, an octopus's brain is very alien to ours. 2/3 of its brain are in its arms, but it's a very clever creature, as we all know. So we can't say that a mental state is its neural correlates. So there must be a multiplicity of different types of physical substrates that are related to the mental state. And if we don't know the criteria, without knowing the criteria by which a physical substrate can instantiate a mental state, we cannot at the least rule out such Fechnerian cosmic sentiences. Like I said before, if you're skeptical about that, total skepticism leads to solipsism. Well, I can only prove that I myself exist, my mentality exists, that's it. But of course, I think it's more plausible than not to deny solipsism, so we have to bequeath sentiences to other beings. So why not, as well as down in most panpsychisms, why not up as well? And of course, in the psychedelic literature, we have numerous reports of this feeling. This is from Alan Watts. The individual discovers himself to be one continuous process with God, with the universe. To those who have known it, it is as real and overwhelming as falling in love. I personally have never experienced this, but I met a lot of people who have. Such a understanding is what William James called noetic. He talks about that with regard to mystical experiences, which he starts off with alcohol even. Alcohol is the first step of the mystical consciousness, he says. It's a form of knowing, he says, which is as valid as any mathematical deduction or whatever. But like I said, I haven't had it myself, and if you haven't had it yourself, it's hard to believe. As I'm in Stockholm, I had to mention this guy, the great Swedish writer Patrick Lundborg, or I should say Lundborg, or whatever. I often ask Swedish people, Patrick Lundborg, right? And they're like, no. I say, he's a famous Swedish psychonaut. Patrick, never heard of him. And then I say Lundborg. Like, yeah, of course, right. He died, unfortunately, a few years ago. He's got a great book called Psychedelia. He writes this: pantheism is a psychedelic core value. The fundamental psychedelic experience from which pantheism emerges occurs in an almost automatic manner. The pantheistic insight brings an important ethical dimension to psychedelia. A lot of questions stemming from this. So what ethical dimension is he talking about? Well, obviously, ecological values. You know, if you believe that the whole of nature is imbued with sentience, you would have more respect for it. Interesting, though, because that's the complete opposite of what Bertrand Russell wrote. Bertrand Russell had a mystical experience. He writes about seeing things and whatever. He wrote an article called Mysticism and Logic, and he writes that mysticism, in which I include psychedelic experience, leads to nihilism. That good and evil are illusory. So it's an interesting question whether psychedelics sort of promote a moral point of view or whether they actually get rid of it, get rid of social customs and mores, and lead to something more enlightened. Something we can discuss, perhaps. However, there's this point. Even if there were celestial sentiences, why would a human be able to fuse with them via psychedelics? Well, like I said, one Whiteheadian response is this, that all perception involves the actual reception of external feelings into oneself, vectorization, and normally we have what he calls negative prehensions, which cut off most of reality. You know, we only see that of reality which is useful for our practical needs. But maybe that function is cut off through psychedelics, and thus we are open to other sentiences from below, but also from above, perhaps. Whitehead believed in a god, in a sort of pantheistic god, which was also transcendental, though. Another response is via cosmopsychism. Sentience is provided top-down, so that chemical disturbance in the organism interferes with the limitation operandi. It's an interesting thought. It would take a lot of articles to make the case more strong, but nonetheless, I thought I should mention it as it is such a common psychedelic viewpoint. The last way you can interpret psychedelic experience is through the third realm. Now, a lot of panpsychists, like Whitehead and Russell, believe in this third realm. I'll explain it in a moment. The term itself comes from Frege, the great logician Frege. He writes this. I'll explain it afterwards. A third realm must be recognized. What belongs to this corresponds with ideas, in that it cannot be perceived by the senses, but with things, in that it needs no bearer to the contents of whose consciousness to belong. Thus, the thought, for example, which we expressed in the Pythagorean theorem, is timelessly true, independently of whether anyone takes it to be true. It needs no bearer. It's not true for the first time when it's discovered, but it's like a planet which already, before anyone has seen it, has been in interaction with other planets. Okay, what does that mean? Well, Frege, Whitehead, Russell, Santayana, Kurt Gödel, who came up with the incompleteness theorems, many other great thinkers, not to mention Plato, believed in this third realm. So what is basically the question of what is reality? So we have the mental realm, ideas. We think about the physical realm as distinct from that, although I'd say ultimately that's an abstraction. But as well, we have a third realm of ideas which are not temporal, thus they are eternal. Something I need to go into more, I can't talk about it now in detail, but sort of compelling evidence for that. For example, what Russell writes about whiteness, you know, the color whiteness. He says, you know, if whiteness were an idea, no two people could have the same idea. Well, of course we do. So in other words, we can instantiate whiteness, but whiteness exists whether or not anyone's thinking about it or having the experience. It exists in this, it subsists, he says, in this eternal realm. He writes, a universal, an ion, the objects of the third realm, is neither in space nor in time, neither material nor mental, yet it is something. Whitehead writes this, the mountain endures, but when after ages it has worn away, it has gone. If a replica arises, it is yet a new mountain. But a color is eternal. It haunts time like a spirit. It comes and it goes, but where it comes, it's the same color. It neither survives nor does it live. Roger Penrose, who is a thinker based in England, Sir Roger Penrose, I should say, he believes in the third realm as well, coming from Gödel. He writes, the Mandelbrot set is not an invention of the human mind, it was a discovery. Like Mount Everest, the Mandelbrot set is just there. It doesn't matter whether we discovered it or not, it already existed, not in a material way, not in a mental way, in a third way, in the third realm, as it were. Russell writes this, we may hope in a mystic illumination to see the eternal ideas in the third realm as we see objects of sense, and we may imagine that the ideas exist in heaven. These mystical developments are very natural, but the basis of the theory is in logic, and it is as based in logic that we need to consider it. So that's a representation of the Mandelbrot set, of course. Could it be that in the mystical illumination, in the psychedelic experience, a lot of these eternal ideas, which are usually cut off from us, suddenly become accessible, and thus we see these strange apparitions, even perhaps new colors, things, of course, which are termed ineffable because they've never existed in our era for us to create words for them. Could it be that we have more of a illumination of this realm through psychedelics? Well, this theory of the third realm, originates in Plato, actually Pythagoras before that probably. But Plato's theory of forms, I'm sure most of you have heard of, may have been initiated themselves by psychedelic intake, the Kykeon, the Eleusinian Mysteries. If you've never heard of the Eleusinian Mysteries, they were a yearly occurrence in ancient Greece. People traveled, usually from Athens, 13 miles to Eleusis, and partook in these rituals. One aspect of the ritual was to drink a specific dose of what is known as kykeon, the potion, which contained barley, mint, and water. But there's a lot of evidence to show that that was psychedelic. Albert Hofmann, who created LSD, of course, argued that the ergot, little parasitic fungus found on barley, was, is psychedelic and was probably an aspect of that kykeon. It's the basis of LSD, of course. We can go into that later. There's arguments for and against, but I think most of the evidence points towards the fact that the kykeon was psychedelic. I mean, wine was psychedelic in ancient Greece, so it's not a really big issue. But Plato wrote what you might consider to be the first trip report in history, in the Phaedrus. He writes this, those who behold here any image of that other world of forms is wrapped in amazement. There was a time when we saw beauty shining in brightness, we philosophers following in the train of Zeus and other gods. And then we beheld the beatific vision and were initiated into the mystery which may truly be called the most blessed when we were admitted to the sight of apparitions. So most people believe this was, they were called the mysteries. It was forbidden to speak about them. But most people believe this to be his report of what he experienced at Eleusis. The Phaedrus itself takes place next to a river, which was part of the walk to the lesser mysteries. So it could be the case that Plato, through psychedelics, initiated this idea of the theory of forms and of dualism, substance dualism. In the Phaedo, in Plato's Phaedo, he talks about him wanting to be known as a mystic, as someone associated with the mysteries. He writes that before he introduces his idea of the soul, or substance dualism, which was so influential in Western thought, and the theory of the forms. So not only might we interpret psychedelic experience as being a sort of admission to the third realm, but it might have been that which set off the whole of Western philosophy, if you accept Whitehead's famous claim that Western philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. So that's pretty much it. Summary, three main arguments for panpsychism. And if you accept panpsychism, then there are 4 modes of interpreting psychedelic experience. More details in my book, Pneumonautics, 9 copies of which are available. Thank you.
All right. Always so nice to feel intellectually inferior. Love it. Love to talk to you, Peter. Panpsychism. I was going to attack you for defining consciousness too broadly, but then you plastered that hole.
Sorry.
And then, there is something with how we define sentience, I think, that I think Alexei was sort of nibbling at, which is that I wouldn't like to introduce the concept of will to power in the Nietzschean sense, but will to higher levels of complexity for very, very small things like atoms and molecules. Couldn't there be a connection? Because everything that comes into existence seems to want to form higher grades of complexity in itself for survival or something, right?
Yes.
And so...
Okay, well, interestingly, I got into panpsychism through Nietzsche, believe it or not, because I became very interested in Nietzsche's later work, where he starts to develop this theory of the will to power, Wille zur Macht. He writes about it in some published works, like Beyond Good and Evil, 36, and so on, and it's prevalent in his later works. But he wrote in The Genealogy of Morality, one of his last books, that he was going to publish this book called The Will to Power. It was renamed later to The Revaluation of All Values. But it seems that this was written in the late 80s. In 1889, he went mad, of course, and that was never completed. Of course, a book called The Will to Power was then later released by his sister, and that's a collection of his notes, which perhaps were never intended to be published. But nonetheless, I was looking at those notes, and I was reading about the will to power, and it seems that it was a return to Schopenhauer's will to a certain extent, and Karl Popper called Schopenhauer a Kantian-turned panpsychist. It was a return to this notion of will being inherent in all things, a panpsychism, in other words, a will panpsychism. But yeah, the difference is that whereas Schopenhauer wrote about a will to survive or to live, Nietzsche said, advance that into a will to power, by which he meant a will to development. A greater complexity would be a part of that. So looking into Nietzsche's work, and I think that the will to power does have this panpsychist element. This is disputed in Nietzschean circles, like Mortimer Clark argues for a mechanical view of Nietzsche, but I think it's completely wrong. And we can discuss that later. But I mean, in the notebooks, he says, we should understand the will to power as an affect form. In other words, as an affection, affectation, an emotion, a feeling, a drive. That underlies all energy. So in that sense, he is a panpsychist, and I've got a lot of sympathy for it, certainly.
But when you reduce it down to the smallest part, the panpsychist theory, how is it different from religion in saying that all is one?
Well, number one, panpsychism needn't be cosmopsychism. So panpsychism per se doesn't say all is one. Schopenhauer's version does, for another reason, and cosmopsychism does. How is that different from religion? Well, of course, at the cosmo-psychical level, they are in harmony, but I think the general difference is this, that a panpsychological or cosmo-psychological point of view is based on reasoning, whether that be inductive or analogical or whatever, whereas religion generally is based on faith, so you just believe this, you have an intuition or whatever, that Alan Watts said about his experience of the universe as one. I suppose that's the difference, so a religion might be true or false, but it doesn't need to give reasons. It can do, and that's theology, of course. But I think this is a philosophical doctrine. The religious analog to panpsychism is probably animism, which is a derogatory term.
You think?
Originally, well, I mean, it was originally coined by Tyler, someone called Tyler, and he talked about primitive cultures believing in animism, believing that trees and rivers and mountains had spirits. Of course.
But now we know it's an inherent human quality. It's a human bias. We all apply animism. We see the man in the moon. We imagine there's a man in the sea, or a girl with a fishtail.
Well, children perhaps have this certainly this bias. Yeah, no doubt. But I wouldn't call it a religion here. Would you call it a religion? I mean, it's a religion in certain countries, but not in the West.
Not anymore. No.
So, I mean, the difference is this. Yeah, it's a belief. You inherit it. You just define yourself by that belief, that's religion, I suppose, very broadly speaking, whereas panpsychism at least seeks to ground it in reasons. And psychedelic intake is not so much reasons, but adds, as I was saying, it sort of adds to the apprehension due to getting rid of the prosaic fallacy that Hartshorne talks about and so on.
Yes, and I also felt you were a little unfair against Christianity, because I think when it comes to religious persecution of panpsychists, I mean, the Catholic Church at the height of its power had ample reason, but I mean, if you look at Saul of Tarsus, what's his name, Paulus? Is that Saul of Tarsus? Anyone know their New Testament? Obviously not in this crowd. So,
Saul.
Saul.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Is that his name?
Saint Paul.
Yes,
Yeah.
him. Yeah. Right.
Wrote the Bible and so on.
Yeah. Because he, I mean, if you look at him as the first apostle, he said that we should carry the spirit of the word forward and not the actual word, because you can, use that book.
Yeah. I mean, there was a word. The word. Some people say Aristotle was a panpsychist because he used the word pneuma, and it wasn't the same psyche or anime, but it was a sort of it was translated as breath in the Old Testament, or spirit, the Holy Spirit. You see, so there is a fusion of panpsychological thinking from ancient Greece into the Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and then of course, the New Testament is in Greek anyway.
Yeah, because in Judaism there are certain sects, I suppose you could call them, who believe that God is everything. So, and that's a panpsychist idea, I suppose.
Or pantheist, yeah. I mean, you can be a panpsychist and be a complete atheist, really. Because most panpsychisms stop at the sort of human level, and they would not bequeath sentience to a planet or a sun or the universe. You can take that view and call yourself an atheist and a secularist. There's no contradiction there. I suppose, though, when you talk about if the whole universe had its own subjectivity, then that would pretty much be God. So then you'd have to admit some kind of theism, yeah. But you needn't. It needn't be religious. It needn't be. It can be a secular view.
So, well, if you agree that molecules would have a will to higher grades or orders of complexity, then in the end, if you take it all the way out, the universe would be a very complex organism in itself.
Well, that's the question. How far do you extend it? So Fechner extended this view upwards, but the real question is, what are the necessary substrates of sentience as one unit? And this is unknown. Of course, we have the neural correlates to a certain extent, but because of multiple realization, we realize that that's not. Although that's sufficient, it's not necessary. You could have other substrates which could create the same sentience. Not create, I should say, should correlate to the same sentiences.
So do you think that humans having attained consciousness, we are actually apart from nature? And that all of the rest of nature is a panpsychist sort of...
No, I'd say we are at a high level of complexity of nature. That's mirrored in our body and our sentience. But we are part and parcel of it's the same principle in a human, in a mouse, and in a virus.
All right. And I wanted to take up one last point that I remembered just now is Henry James.
William James' brother.
Yes. Wasn't their father Swedenborgian?
Swedenborgian, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was sort of because that's sort of a panpsychist religion, isn't it?
Okay. I'm not a Swedenborgian specialist, but Kant wrote a book about him, Dreams of the Spirits here, which I've read, and I've read Heaven and Hell by him. But he seems to me to be a dualist, Swedenborg. So he believes that our human consciousnesses can exist without the body, to go to heaven and hell. Panpsychists won't, well, there are many varieties, but generally a panpsychist will say, when the human body is dead, that's it for that particular sentience. Then we break down into the smaller sentiences, as it were. But there's no life after death necessarily, although there are certain panpsychists who could argue for it. Fechner did, for example. But it's not necessary. So again, that's how panpsychism is not a religious view of necessity.
Because I had a DMT trip a few years ago, where I met a lot of small things that my animistic self would see as sort of a Keith Haring-like characters. Yeah, well, it's quite obvious what he had done before he found his voice as an artist. But as I see it, being a super reductionist, I see it as all my sensory organs breaking down. I can see the neurons trying to communicate what they want from me.
Mm-hmm. It could be, but I mean, again, the problem is the ultimate deep question of, okay, I'm not. I mean, obviously, certain visions on psychedelics are related to brain activity, no doubt about it. But the question is, what is that relationship anyway? Between the mind and matter, and that's not determined. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that these eternal objects do exist. Everything we see is actually an inference, a sort of ingression, as Whitehead calls it, from this third realm. But we only see that which is practical to us. So, therefore, with a breakdown in that practical functioning, we do access this greater realm. Something that Gödel believed in, interestingly. Kurt Gödel, it's related to artificial intelligence, because he claimed that he wouldn't have come up with his incompleteness theorems if he did not believe in this third realm. And moreover, the incompleteness theorems led him to that view furthermore. And Roger Penrose, whom I mentioned, he argued that robots or computers will never attain consciousness because of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which were based on the belief in the reality of this third realm. So,
because that's how I understood you when we talked this summer, when we touched upon panpsychism, just briefly at the end of our conversation, that we were just basically antennas receiving a larger consciousness through ourselves.
Yeah.
The man without a brain?
Yes, Lorber, yeah. A Lorber student. Yeah, well, that's a Bergsonian view, yeah. It's... with regard to this, I'm not saying I take any firm view, right? So I'm not going to make the case. I mean, I've got sympathies for Bergsonism, that yes, the brain is simply a receiver of something out there already, and I do believe there's something out there already, but at the same time, there are problems with that, obviously, and I'm undecided, this is the truth,
Well, it is kind of a hard...
I'm undecided, but I realize, what has flaws, and the traditional view of the mind and brain, I think it's deeply flawed. So I can reject that. I think panpsychism is the most logical explanation, but it's got issues as well. And when you get into the third realm aspect of it as well, then it gets very contentious. So I think, the more I read, the more I realize that, we really know very little about this whole thing about sentience. We think we create models and whatever, but they always reach these paradoxes, contradictions, or impasses. And that's why you have to open up, that's why panpsychism is becoming a prevalent view again in the last 15 years, because, okay, maybe we should re-explore this old theory about how mind and matter relate.
But then you have to sort of leave metaphysics and go into religion, because you have to invent some sort of life force, don't you?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, with regard to the abstraction argument, I think it's informative to think of our notion of matter-energy. When you talk about reduction, you're talking about reduction to the matter-energy, which is the common concept that we have today. But then, like I was saying, you look at the history of that, we see that that notion is constantly being augmented. It's evolving, and we're adding properties to matter which we had no idea in the past. I mean, you talk about, for example, properties in quantum physics to someone 100 years ago, they would have thought that's completely religious, magical. But now we accept it, well, people do generally. And there's no reason to believe that matter as we know it today is absolute. The reason for that is ultimately because, it does not explain sentience. We cannot get a proper view of reality without the integration of sentience into our overall ontology, our worldview.
Do you have any questions, or should I?
I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate a bit on the distinction between panpsychism and pan-protopsychism. Because it seems like a relevant question in light of the... What was the phrase? The eternal battle between emergentism and panpsychism. You can sort of touch on some of the philosophical foundations of both of those positions. In a way.
Okay. Well, the difference is this, that panpsychism believes that matter and mind are essentially one thing, and we understand them as two things by artificially abstracting them. Whereas pan-proto-psychism is the view that mind and matter are both emergent out of something which is neither of the two. It's not mind, it's not matter. It's a neutral substance. That's why this is also known as neutral monism. A lot of people read Russell in this view, and it's an interesting point of view. But Galen Strawson, who's probably the most prevalent analytical philosopher on panpsychism, he's got a problem with it because ultimately, yeah, it is emergence. You know, from something which is not mental, you get the emergence of something mental and physical. But then you've got this. If one of the main arguments for panpsychism is anti-emergentism, the genetic argument, then you've got this issue. Well, you've got emergentism again, you know, here. So this is not a helpful alternate. But people are looking into it. There's a lot of research on that at the moment, conferences and so on. But I personally think, yeah, no, it's you know, the problem of emergence then re-emerges. So.
Yes, because I still don't really see how they are mutually exclusive, emergence and panpsychism.
Well, it's because
either way you divide it, you have to come down to a point where they either come into existence simultaneously, or they grow, or
growth of matter, the evolution of matter into, you know, atoms, molecules, planets, galaxies, and so on, is concurrent with the evolution of mind, right? So they are always together because, like I say, I emphasize this point. Our notion of matter energy, as we'd call it today, is an abstraction. It's not a real thing. It's a logical construction. It would be very presumptive to think that we've now attained knowledge of what matter actually is, right? So the argument from the panpsychist point of view is this. If emergentism fails for the reasons given, like mental causation, the fact that we've got no scientific laws, transorder nomology, to explain how mind could emerge from matter, you know, it's not a scientific view, emergentism, by the way. It's a materialist view. It's not scientific. Is it not more parsimonious, more plausible to say, okay, we can't explain how emergentism works at all, therefore, let's say that the mind didn't emerge, right? Now, what does that imply? If the mind did not emerge, then it always existed. And if it always existed, it didn't only exist in us humans, it must predate us humans as well, and that's panpsychism then, because it must have existed in pre-organic molecules and whatnot.
God, it's impossible to nail you.
So this parsimonious nature, is that something that's ubiquitous also in materia? Or?
Well, I suppose it's rather that Can
you repeat it? The parsimonious nature, is that ubiquitous in?
Well, the parsimony, which means using as few axioms as possible to explain something, you know, a more aesthetic kind of, as mathematicians and scientists always, it's more parsimonious to think that mind and matter are one thing than to think they are two things that somehow interact in whatever way, emerge or have a downward causation or whatever they may be. So the parsimony lies in the fact that it's more of a monism, you know, you're saying that there's not mind and matter. These are just our human constructions. There is mind matter, as it were, mind dust, mind stuff, as some panpsychists say. And that is the concrete reality. But from that concrete reality, we come up with these concepts and so on, you know, which is the advance of science. But like I say, this is an inheritance, at the moment, it's an inheritance probably from Descartes. We think of matter simply in mechanical terms. Descartes was a mathematician, of course, and so you'd like to think of the world as completely sufficiently describable in terms of extension, space, right, and time. Therefore, denied sentience in other beings, except for humans, and this is a legacy that we live with. But like I say, although I think there's another reason for the forsaking of panpsychism is this. This worldview, mechanism, or materialism, or whatever you may call it, is very practical, it's very useful, because we create technology. All this technology is created, you know, on the basis of that being the case. You know, the laws of nature as we understand them. You know, it's been very influential in the industrial age, in the information age now, and so we think, well, it works. You know, it explains so much, so surely then it can explain everything. But of course, I say no, it can't. It's got its limit. It's useful, but that doesn't mean it's therefore true. It's got its limitations. People used to believe Newtonian physics. I mean, Kant believed that Newton discovered the laws of nature. That was it, and that worked. We created satellite systems based on that, really. But then, of course, there were certain things it didn't explain. Like the perihelion of Mercury didn't explain that. People didn't really bother. People to think, yeah, but it must fit in somehow in the future. Someone will work it out. And I think that's the state we're in with sentience and the laws of nature today. We think, there are problems with like emergentism or identity theory and so on. Well, we'll sort it out under this general framework. But my point is that no, look, this is one of those anomalies that disproves the whole thing. Even though it's useful, it cannot be comprehensive. So in the future, we'll see the joining, I think, of physics and psychology. This will have an overall more explanatory. This will be a better, superior ontology.
It was Descartes who also said that the magpie had a soul.
Well, so
because
before I didn't. Did I say that?
Well, I thought it was interesting because the European magpie is one of the few species on planet Earth that passes the mirror test of consciousness. It recognizes itself in the mirror.
Right. Descartes said that magpies had feelings in passing in a letter, and this goes against what he said before, that all animals are automatons. And Cottingham, I think, wrote a paper on this, saying, ultimately Descartes confused, contradicts himself. And but the stereotype is that he thought all of the natural world was mechanical, and that's his famous substance dualism. So that is his main contention. But the problem, of course, is I think it'd be hard to deny that magpies have a form of sentience, especially when you see behavior like that. It's very hard to deny that. But that doesn't make sense in Descartes' whole scheme. You see, so he's using sort of common sense, contradicted his philosophical system, and in the end, it was just left like that. But again, it's a sign that the whole system was flawed.
But what do you think about a mirror test as a proof of consciousness?
I don't think it's proof of consciousness because you could program a robot to be able to recognize itself in a mirror, but at the same time, that robot needn't be sentient. So it's like the Turing test. Turing himself didn't think this was a test of sentience, but his followers did. So if you don't know the Turing test, it's this, that you write questions to a computer screen and you get replies, and if you can't judge whether those replies are automated, machine-like, or whether they're humans, then you've reached a stage where where computers have attained consciousness. I think that's completely wrong because there's a massive difference between simulating consciousness. This is what John Searle, the American philosopher, always brings out. There's a massive difference between simulating consciousness and recreating consciousness. So I don't think this is at all good proof of consciousness, really.
You've talked a lot about the limits of materialism, as it were, up until now. But of course, the other extreme end of the spectrum of opinions is straight-up idealism, which you say that you dabbled in one point. So I was wondering if you'd like to tell us more about the process in which you decided that panpsychism was a more reasonable school of thought to identify with.
Okay, right. So I would call a number of years ago, would have called myself a Schopenhauerian, because reason being, studied Kant at university, I studied Nietzsche at university. I didn't study Schopenhauer at university, but he's the obvious bridge. He's the bridge between the two, and really to understand Nietzsche, you need to have read Schopenhauer, I now realize. But anyway, I really got into him because in one sense he was as inspirational as Nietzsche. In another sense, he became almost as technical as Kant. So for me, that's the ideal, you're sort of mixture between this great inspiring passion, but also the logical reasoning there. And his famous book is called The World as Will and Representation, which then inspired Nietzsche, as I was saying. But what brought me away from this really was reading Whitehead. So Nietzsche, then Schopenhauer got me into panpsychism, and I was seeing the positives of it. But then I was reading years ago now, people saying Whitehead, he's the shit, he's the main panpsychist thinker, the most systematic thinker. So I thought, okay, I better get into this guy, and I did. And then he had arguments against idealism, which changed my view, actually, then. The the main reason was this, that like most materialisms, idealism believes that what we see is a representation of reality, you know, so our brains somehow conjure up an image of the world around us, you know, and then the question is, yeah, but that is that representative of reality as it is in itself, you know, and this is then we get questions about naive realism and so on, and solipsism and whatnot, and yeah, you know, this is an interesting question, but then Whitehead said, well, in believing that, you are assuming that when you perceive something, that perception is not part of the object perceived. So for Whitehead, when you see something, that is causality. You know, it gets deep, but for Whitehead, perception and causality are the same thing. When you see something, that thing, right, so he's a process philosopher, so there are no such thing as things, there are processes. Like a star is, okay, a spherical ball of fire, whatnot, but also the light that emanates from a star is part of that star. It's, you know, it's only language which distinguishes it. You know, there's a star and there's a light that comes out of it as if it's two things. Really, it's one process. But even more than that process of starlight hitting your retina, going into your brain, changing your you know, the activity, the process which you yourself are, leading to you to say something like, look, a star, that is all one big process. And so the perception is not like a representation necessarily of the star out there, but that a part, not whole, a small part of that star becomes part of you because it's just one long process, you see. So that's what really took me out of idealism, this view that representationalism is a non-process view of philosophy. It's a really belief in like subjects and objects as if they're separate things, whereas this is a trick of language, ultimately.
But would a non-representational idealism then, in essence, be the same as panpsychism?
Yeah, okay, so if you have a non-representational idealism, I mean, you could hardly call it idealism because it means like ideaism, everything's an idea. But, yeah, no, I suppose you could have like, you can say in panpsychism that everything we see around us is our biased view of perception, you know, like, so everything we see now, it's that small slit of electromagnetism which makes the colors for us. There is much more out there. We can't see a lot of stuff, gravity, whatever. So our view of the world is fractional. It's a perspective of what's out there, and like I was saying before, it's that which is useful to us as human beings. You know, we've evolved to perceive that which is useful to us. Other organisms will perceive other things, deer, bees, ultraviolet, and so on and so forth, right? So I suppose in that sense, you could say that the world you see around you is like a representation of reality, but actually reality is much bigger than that. So, okay, you know, if you can swing language that way, yeah. But I like, you know, generally speaking, though, I'd say it's incompatible.
Fair point.
I just had maybe a slightly more narrow question. The slide about sentience, the different aspects about sentience, of sentience, the conceptual or the information processing, or cognitive side of it versus the experiential side, the phenomenal side, yeah. Do you think that they, I mean, it seems reasonable to assume that they, from an evolutionary standpoint, that they co-evolve, that you probably won't find one without the other. But then computers seem to be doing a lot of information processing and reasoning without the experiential side, or?
Well, I'd say this. I don't think they co-evolved. I think that part of consciousness, concepts and reason, is a later aspect of higher consciousnesses. For example, I don't think a virus will have concepts. I think it will have.
No, I reacted to that as well.
Yeah, right. So that's what I mean. So you can have aesthesis, as it's known, you know, phenomenal consciousness without concepts. With regard to computers having, I don't quite get your point there. So computers. Can you repeat that?
I think in nature it seems safe to assume that these two different aspects co-evolve, or that they coincide.
Right, that's what you meant, right? Okay,
But obviously, computers are created by man, but they seem to be doing a lot of information processing, and we can't quite be sure whether they have some inner experience.
You know, I mentioned integrated information theory, which is a sort of neuroscientific version of panpsychism. I read Christoph Koch's autobiography, and he writes, you know, I admitted to myself recently that I am a panpsychist, you know, he had to admit that to himself. But I mean, they take it very far. They attribute, because talking about the criteria of consciousness, they talk about it being based on the amount of integrated information, you know, so in that sense, you know, we have a lot of integrated information, but a plant does as well, so it's got a low level of sentience. Perhaps a planet, I don't think they dare to talk about that, but the implication is there. The question is, but they will say, yeah, well, actually, we can't deny it to a mobile phone either, right? And this is why I would differ from them. Because it seems to me that from a Whiteheadian point of view, an organism is part and parcel of its past. You know, its present state is legacy of its past, which goes through evolution, you know. And a mobile phone or a machine has not evolved, so it lacks that. But I must admit that the question whether we will be able to create artificial consciousness, there's a difference between intelligence and consciousness, right? Very important that a lot of people miss, you know, that a computer can be very intelligent and can work things out, facial recognition, whatnot. That doesn't mean it's conscious of it. It can be completely automated. The interesting question then is whether you can get a conscious machine. And I'm open-minded about that. I mean, I'm open to the possibility, but how would you ever know? Because I mean, this is the whole problem about proof in terms of mind-matter theories, you know? If you take a Blade Runner, whatever, you talk about these replicants, whatever they're called, you know, you can do a test on them and so on. But even then, I mean, like, you could imagine conceptually, like, a robot could be very, very I mean, it's an extension of the Turing test. You can create a robot which is fully human-like, you know? And they could be extremely subtle in facial expressions, whatever. That still doesn't logically imply that they are conscious. They could be very, very good replicators, simulations. But then I'm not saying it's impossible either.
Just the integration seems like the central point.
Yeah.
Integration. Yeah.
That's right. Integration. When you see a physical system that's integrated, that seems to suggest the sentience attributed to it. One thing I didn't mention, which is very important, a lot of people, you know, quickly reject panpsychism because they say, oh, so you think tables and chairs are conscious, right? But modern panpsychists don't think that at all, because these are not integrated systems. You know, these are man-made artificial conceptions. We would not attribute a consciousness to the table as such, or the chair as such. We would only attribute it to the self-sufficient autopoietic systems within the table, i.e. the molecules, which have a very mild basic form of sentience, but not the table. And that's the difference between the living and the dead. You know, a living body will have an integrated process of information. A dead body will not. That process has stopped. And so then the sentiences dissipate into the what then becomes autopoietic, which will be, you know, ultimately the molecules and so on. So obviously that criteria I was talking about involves integration. But then the point of panpsychism is that there is integration at all levels of nature anyway.
Right, so I think relating to that, it feels a little bit to me, and perhaps you can explain to me why it's not like that.
Passive aggression there.
Exactly, yeah. Well, no, it's not passive, it has agency, and that's the problem.
Okay.
We have sentience in everything, but it seems that in order to explain where agency arises, mustn't there be some sort of emergentism?
By agency, you're talking about freedom?
Well, freedom or an agency or the will to do anything, or, the pinnacle of that then being consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends what panpsychist you look at, but for example, Whitehead then, who's my main emphasis at the moment, he says that there is agency in all what he calls actual entities, and that's the fundamental sentient units. So an electron is a city of these. But an electron, an actual entity, or an actual occasion, or an occasion of experience, all synonyms, more or less, they all have agency in that sense. They all have what he calls a subjective aim. They have an aim to create a unified whole through prehensions. But but ultimately the point is, without getting technical on Whitehead, the point is that yes, no, agency is universal. It's in the minutest of subjective units.
So all agency has a quality. It is an agency to something. It is. I mean, agency cannot be general. Agency must be pointed.
Intentional, you mean?
And well, not only intentional, but it must have direction. It cannot be a general agency to X. Agency must be an agency to something.
So, in other words, final cause, a telos.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So then my question to you is, why is it not then the agency in and of itself that is the central unit?
In a way, it is for Whitehead. I mean, like I was saying, the subjective aim in Whitehead's actual entity is a telos, like a final cause, and it aims at something that Whitehead calls satisfaction, or completion of the actual entity, and then it moves on. And ultimately, that satisfaction is, for Whitehead now, getting somewhere else, but that's an aesthetic appreciation. So at the fundamental level of reality, we have these agencies which are always aiming at aesthetic appreciation. Ultimately, don't always succeed, but this is the factor in at the basis of reality, which then later on explains appreciation of art, which can't. It's very hard to explain why we appreciate like the beauty from a mechanistic point of view. The basic way, obviously, is saying like, well, you know, we value beauty because we value beauty in a prospective mate because we'll have healthy children, blah blah blah. Okay, but that doesn't explain beauty in music at all, or in landscapes necessarily, or in poetry and whatnot, right? So, again, a bit like the emergence of mind from matter, this mechanistic theory, which is, again, the legacy of Descartes, reaches another anomaly, another impasse. So that then explains why we appreciate art, well, with a few additional books on top of what I said, and also how agency, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So
the appreciation is the point. Essentially, the art appreciates itself. You could almost say.
Except I don't. With Whitehead, he does bring in God here. So so I don't want to go there because it conflicts with my Nietzscheanism. But ultimately, God is both transcendent, so he's in that third realm. Called the primordial nature of God, and he is pantheistic in the sense that he experiences everything that we experience, or whatever, and not only us, but all organisms, which is for Whitehead includes molecules. So for Whitehead, there's no distinction between the organic and inorganic. This is again another artificial dichotomy. But yeah, so there is that aspect of Whitehead, the sort of theological part, which I try to avoid, but. To answer your question fully, you need to look into that. Yeah.
That's too bad, because you brought up Bertrand Russell, who has certain problems with mysticism, and so do I. Because I find when you go into the mystics, you enter a relative universe where good and evil doesn't exist, which I think you could appreciate being a Nietzschean. Good and evil are human concepts, are they not?
So this is a very interesting point, and the nature of morality and psychedelic experience or mystical experience. I'd say that most people think that a psychedelic experience brings them morality. I mean, for example, in my case, I certainly appreciate nature more. I have much more valuation of nature, not Nietzsche, after psychedelics. Well, Nietzsche as well, actually. There you go. Both Nietzsche and nature, from psychedelics. But, yeah. Question is this, okay, but that's a feeling. That's not necessarily morality per se. That might be considered sentimentalism from another morality. And, something that Octavio Paz writes, he was a Nobel laureate who wrote about psychedelics and Nietzsche in the 50s, 60s. He wrote that, psychedelics take you away. You look at your society and you laugh at all the silly rules and uniforms and ways of life, customs. You get an outside perspective, and that's how psychedelics and Nietzsche are similar, because they give you that outside perspective. And of course, for Nietzsche, that includes morality as part of the customs. And so Octavio Paz and Bertrand Russell, they say, it also takes you outside of morality. Even for Whitehead, he said, importance transcends morality, logic, art, and religion. There's something more there. So I think I would say this, that, yeah, no, it can certainly foster an appreciation of nature which would be useful, for example, for an ecological morality, but at the same time, you can place that type of morality in a subjective Nietzschean realm, you know, that it's not absolute, it's not objective, it's not like we therefore have to, there's no moral absolute to say that we must do that, but rather it just pushes you that way naturally, and you'd want to do it, you know, but nonetheless, I think that it can take you out of your society and make you realize that all these beliefs you formerly had are actually just inculcated.
Yeah, but that's the thing, because I've met you a few times now, and I know you're a pretty good-hearted person, whereas I see death and destruction everywhere. So if I take LSD or something and enter a relative universe, or see the universe and the planet as one organism, I can, justify my will to destroy things by saying I am just a natural part of the order. I am the destructive part of the force.
And also, you can say death is not meaningless. You know, this is another mystical thing. You know, I mean, the whole thing about the Eleusinian Mysteries was it prepares you for death. You no longer fear death after you've become an initiate. You've experienced that mystery in Greece, and I think that's quite common as well. So, therefore, what does it matter if you kill a lot of people and whatever, right? You can go that way. I don't think a lot of people do go that way, but at the same time, I think these drugs don't have the same effect on the same people. So they have different effects on different people, and there's no one right way. I mean, I remember Andy Roberts writing about how LSD was used by football hooligans, you know, and to make them a bit more, greater at fighting, you know, when they need to be, you know. It can lead to this. I think what happened historically, though, is that in the 60s, psychedelics and a sort of New Age left ideology married. And thus we get this view that psychedelics is married to this sort of left-wing ideology. But if you look before that in history, I mean, Ernst Jünger, who was a Nazi, and so on, he was, Albert Hoffman devoted a whole chapter to him in his book, LSD, My Problem Child. He thinks that you shouldn't give psychedelics to people, and it's too dangerous, and the truths are too profound, and so on. I would say that psychedelics are mind expanders and certainly won't therefore pigeonhole you in any whatever it may be, in any particular ideology.
And then you end up in moral relativism.
Yeah, the abyss. Yeah, that's where I am. Yeah. It's a hard life. Yeah.
But while we're on the subject of mysticism, I'd like to highlight a common feature of mystical experiences that may or may not be in conflict with at least the process philosophical variety of panpsychism. That's, particularly in the so-called Eastern traditions, but also in the Christian mystical traditions as well. Even there, one of the deepest level of a mystical experience can often be something which is described as a pure consciousness without any object of consciousness, really. It's just a consciousness in itself without any intentionality, without any content, really. Now, that seems to contrast quite starkly with the process philosophical view of consciousness, where there's always a relationality, there's always a form of intentionality in the very...
Yeah.
You don't agree? Would you like to...
Okay. It's a very interesting point. For those of you who don't know, Franz Brentano, 100 years ago or so, came up with this idea of intentionality, which actually means that the distinguishing feature of consciousness is that it's always about something. You love something. You think about something. You feel about something. And this is not a property of matter. And this is a fundamental distinction. Now, I disagree with that. I think that it can be an aspect of consciousness, intentionality, and it's quite common, but it needn't be. Like I was talking about aesthesis, which is the opposite of access consciousness. Or the subconscious, if you believe in that. Brentano actually argued against the existence of the subconscious for this reason. But if you believe in the subconscious, then yes, you have objects like, colors or whatever, but you don't think about them. They are just there per se, as it were, right? And certainly Whitehead allows for this as well. and he's, of course, known as the father of process philosophy. So I don't think that it does really number one, it's very interesting that the report of this experience happens, because that would seem to refute Brentano's view of intentionality. So consciousness doesn't have to have that. That's something, and that's how, again, psychedelics is important for philosophy of mind. Seems like introspective refutation. But secondly, I don't think it is in conflict with process philosophy. Like I said, I think intentionality is not a necessary aspect of process philosophy. But that's a big debate.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. It's really nice to have such an interesting topic on board. It's been a big part of my life as well, thinking about this subject. Yeah, so the way you describe panpsychism, which I'm certainly very sympathetic to, is quite, as some other people has also recognized quite coherent with the kind of emergentism, because you still require some kind of criteria in order for a process to be sort of centered around the subject, right? So there's information integration, could be that kind of criteria, or there could be some other kind of principle. And I would especially like to bring up a certain research called Carl Friston. I'm not sure if anybody has heard about Carl Friston. He's a neuroscientist who became famous during the last years for a theory called free energy principle. And it's not related to free energy in the sort of stupid way, okay? So it's just a sort of a very mathematical global brain theory about like how biological systems in general tend to organize themselves like on a sort of almost physical but still emergent level. I have a hard time really understanding these theories. That's why I'm also asking if anybody else wants to help me. But it seems to be a really good candidate for consciousness as well, and he seems to believe in it, although he's quite humble in that opinion. But I think everybody should look into that, because it's like an organizing principle, like similar to information integration, that sort of could explain the center of our being, but also be the center of any kind of process, really. So it could be panpsychist in that sense as well.
Oh, yeah? Okay, interesting. I'll look into it.
But if I can just shortly try to explain it, the idea is sort of in the center of the mind and in the center of any kind of maybe integrated process of some sort, there is a kind of want to remove the free information or the free energy in the system, and also to sort of always come up with situations in perception that sort of are as close as possible to your predictions. So sort of Bayesian system, if you know Bayes' theorem, and we also sort of create situations in a sense to make our predictions true. So we not only our emotions and our perceptions and everything feeds into our sort of confirmation bias would sort of lie at the heart of consciousness, even if this would be true. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, I'll look into that. Yeah.
But the general sort of question for you would be like, what is your thought about this sort of boundary of consciousness? Because if you are a panpsychist, which I am as well in a sense, but still a question of where does it like. My consciousness doesn't feel infinite in some sense. Like I can think about something quite deeply, but there's still sort of a limit always. And yeah.
Well, this is the big unknown. I mean, if you're talking about the what determines something as sentient, like I was saying, it's some form of integrated information, probably, but maybe more to it as well. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, we have evolved, as I say as well, to have a certain specific kind of consciousness which serves our needs. But of course that is, one has to understand that is a very biased way of looking at the world. So what we're missing is, well, you can't become another animal to know, can you? But that's why psychedelics are important, because they do then free the mind, and we get at least the notion that there are other forms of consciousness out there, which then inspires us to find.
Do they? Because I feel sometimes they make people feel really locked inside their heads.
But even that is a form of consciousness, of course. Another form. Psychedelics aren't always pleasurable. I mean, that's what I always say when, I suppose you have more of a problem here in Sweden admitting to people that you take psychedelics because you live in such an authoritarian state. But even I don't want to go there, but
nobody here has ever done any drugs.
But,
so.
of course, yeah, nor have I. I was just lying about it. But I, in England, when I say, you know, when I want to sort of justify myself, I mean, people immediately, without knowing anything about it, will think, oh, it's just drugs, cocaine, it's like heroin, whatever, it's just for a rush. I always emphasize the academic, intellectual aspect of it, which it was, you know, if you look at Aldous Huxley, even people, William James and so on, it was an intellectual endeavor. It just became a recreational thing in the mid-20th century, which then has now given it this negative connotation. But, you know, Thomas Metzinger, the great German philosopher, he was recently interviewed by Sam Harris, and he said, Sam Harris asked him if he had taken psychedelics, you know, and he said, well, you're asking me to admit a crime, you know, on radio. I'm not going to do that. But he said something like this, you know, if you're a genuine consciousness researcher, you have to do the research. And he left it there. So I think, you know, you can do philosophy of mind, psychology, cognitive science, whatever, without taking these things. But it's a bit like studying music without having listened to anything before the 20th century. You don't know what's available. David Nutt, he was here once, right? He said, if you want to understand consciousness, you've got to look at psychedelics. And so it's becoming clear to people, I think, in academia, that, yeah, psychedelics now are offering a whole new field to explore these theories. That's partly what I'm talking about. And so the next step is to make them intellectually respectable. And you're always faced with, like, I mean, I'm doubly in trouble because panpsychism is in the same state, you know? So I'm sort of pushing panpsychism and psychedelic research. But, you know, I think they're both valid intellectual fields of inquiry. So I guess that's why you're all here as well. So give yourself a round of applause. There you go.
And with that question of boundaries of consciousness, I think the boundary for the panel is also set. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Robin, Fredrik, and Edvin, Aron, and Peter, everyone.